the dynamic, the underlying dynamic that allows these tyrants to hold on to power is their exploitation of a very natural human vulnerability, but a very natural human fear of being cast out, being socially rejected and ostracized. And the flip side of that fear is that human beings, we have a very natural need to be accepted.
Well, welcome to the Anne and Phelim Scoop with me, Anne McElhenney, and with...
I'm in Ireland with the world's worst internet, which is apparently freezing a lot. So I'm seeing my wife in rather frozen pictures. But yes, I'm in Ireland to bring you all the madness, where we're going to have a teaching of gender identity on all curriculums in schools, including Catholic schools. But we can't get internet so that I can do the podcast. Maybe that's delivered. What else is on the show, Juan?
Yes, well, obviously we're starting out the show with all the massive news that just broke on. We're recording this on Monday, where the massive news broke about Tucker Carlson and about Don Lemon. So we're going to talk about that in a second. We're also going to talk about, we just had Earth Day, so we have some thoughts about Earth Day, and then we're going to go over to an interview I did earlier with Stella Morabito on her new book called The Weaponization of Loneliness. Quite an extraordinary title that just caught my eye on Friday. And we have a margarita recipe because I spent the weekend with a friend who was lonely in Mexico. I'm just that kind of friend. You know, you can just depend on me to go to Cabo if you're lonely. Just putting that out there. And we're going to close the show with a bit of madness from Denmark because the Danes have definitely done it this time. You know, but we're going to start, Phelim, we're going to start though talking about this news that, you know, as we just start recording today, has dropped first of all about Tucker Carlson and then followed up by Don Lemon. What do you think, Phelim?
Well, Tucker Carlson, I've been talking to him for a few months now about coming on board to the Anne and Phelim Scoop. You know, and I obviously things are at a very confidential stage.
Yes.
You know, we can't go any further, but, you know, the Anne and Phelim and Tucker Scoop, that's really the issue, is he wants it to be the Tucker, Anne and Phelim Scoop. And, you know... That's
right. And I'm just not willing to give way to the fact that my name needs to be always mentioned first.
Credit's important, you know, credit where credit's due.
Yes, yeah. The principle of the thing.
I don't have much experience of TV newsrooms. I have a lot of experience in newsrooms. I don't think it's got anything to do with Dominion and the settlement. People settle lawsuits all the time. As we'll be talking, CNN settled a lawsuit where they accused 16-year-old boys of being racists falsely, and no one lost their job. So a bit of reporting on what the president thinks about the recent election shouldn't lose anyone their job, really. I think Tucker has bigger fish to fry. I think people should look at the recent interview he did with Elon Musk. As a possible funder for his new project. Tucker has formed. He created the Daily Caller, which was a very successful outlet at the time. If Elon Musk decides to put $1 billion into, because Elon has got the appetite now for causing trouble. It's no longer enough to put rockets into space. He wants to put rockets up people's whatevers. So, see what I did there? So I think that's what Tucker. I would suspect that's where Tucker's going. You know, I mean, Tucker doesn't want to go the route of podcasting because he could end up like Joe Rogan, but he could also end up like Bill O'Reilly. And I think he's more likely to end up like Joe Rogan, by the way. But it's lonely out there, and even Joe Rogan came into Spotify. Spotify will not make that same mistake again. And, you know, because these people tend to have real opinions that they don't like and that their workers don't like. So I think Tucker's going to emerge in some kind of Elon Musk vehicle, but that's pure speculation.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting idea that you mentioned. And I think, you know, a lot of people were talking about the Elon Musk interview over the weekend. Everyone, you know, a lot of people tuned into that. And as you say, you know, it's small change in a way for Elon Musk to do something. Yeah. And I think he's had kind of an experience with Twitter where I mean, a lot of people have been so impressed with what he's managed to do there that they're thinking, and he's not one of those people. I also think that the way he operates, the way Elon Musk seems to operate is, he thinks of something and he just goes ahead and does it. I mean, obviously, in a very small way, the story that we highlighted last week with the BBC journalist, where the journalist wrote to him and said, "Hey, what about an interview at the BBC?" And he went, "Let's do it now." And it's like, right, no big massive lead in. So I think it's very possible. They obviously spent some time together, and who knows what came out of that. But we're going to know.
It's
and
funny.
by the time this gets aired, you're going to know more.
It's interesting, actually, when you think about it. Doesn't Tucker? Elon Musk had a very tumultuous childhood. Didn't he have a violent father? And doesn't Tucker have a childhood as well that was very disturbing? I think he has a parent.
Interesting.
I think I read somewhere he had a parent who did his mother abandon him or something like that. So they probably have bonded over that, and so you can imagine. And Tucker is, to his credit, an original thinker. He doesn't follow the pack, and calls out all sorts of people about all sorts of things. And you won't read this anywhere else, but he did call out some of the more outrageous election claims by one of Trump's lawyers. I remember he said to the lawyer, "Come on with your evidence and I'll give you the full hour." And she wouldn't come on. And it's like, okay. And this is during the febrile times when everyone was saying the election was stolen. So he's not afraid to even anger his own crowd, and take them on when he sees. So I think himself and Elon could have a lot of fun together. And I think both of them, that's what they want. So talking of fun, Anne, Don Lemon is no longer your friend, Don Lemon.
Oh, Don Lemon. I mean, obviously we're totally brokenhearted today to find out that Don Lemon has gotten the shove. But to look at, obviously Don Lemon, and I just love, who is it calls him that film?
Tucker.
Oh yeah, Don Lemon. It's just delightful. But what's really, I think, interesting about Don Lemon finally in 2023, in nearly May of 2023, getting the shove is why did it take so long? And I think, they talk about white privilege. Forget about that. There's no such thing as white privilege, but there certainly is gay, black privilege, which was what we seem to be seeing here. And the reason I say that is, Variety have kind of done a deep dive into some of these accusations against Don Lemon and things that were discovered about him. And what I find frightening and completely shocking about this is that back in 2008, back in 2008, Don Lemon was co-anchoring CNN's show called Live From, which was a weekday show he did with a lady called Kyra Phillips. And it was a gig that he had landed after he arrived at the network from a news show in Chicago. Long story short, Kyra Phillips started to get really abusive text messages from from a phone she didn't recognize. It was a number she didn't recognize, and quite horrible messages. Well, bizarrely, or not bizarrely at all, maybe, because we know a lot more about Don Lemon now. It was from Don Lemon, and it was discovered that it was from Don Lemon. But guess what? 2023, it's taken from then till 2023 for him to finally get sacked by CNN. And of course, we know the more recent history with Nikki Haley, where he said she was past her prime,
Yeah. Well, actually, and then he made his fellow co-hosts cry and was rude to them and patronizing to them. I mean, he does seem to have a problem with the ladies, Mr. Lemon does now, for whatever reason. He doesn't seem to rate their opinions too much. And by the way, just on, not the words I hate to say, in defense of Don Lemon, I mean, Nikki Haley started it. Nikki Haley started this thing about age, that we need people who are not old and, we need a new generation, a new voice. And, I'm the young voice. And, and she ran with this, if you're old, I mean, we know Richard Vigorian. He's the youngest man we know, and I don't know if he's 90 yet, right? And, it's like Hillary Clinton used to run on, I've had more air miles as Secretary of State than anyone else. Air miles is not an achievement. Youth is not an achievement. Age is not an achievement. Nikki Haley, if you're going to run on age, then be prepared for people to say, well, actually, at 50, maybe you'd be better at 35. I don't know what age Nikki Haley is. Is she 55? So she was the one who made her age an issue. So anyway, that does not get away from the fact that Don Lemon is a talentless and that's the big cardinal sin with him, is that he's talentless, not bright at all. He was great when he had Trump and when he had someone else writing his script.
So yeah, we just lost Phelim right there. So that's Ireland for you. It's everything you kind of need to know about Ireland. But we kind of said everything I wanted to say about Nikki Haley. You know, what an extraordinary thing to say. What a dreadful thing to say. And in these sensitive times we live, by the way, you know, the idea that she's not in her prime or whatever, or, you know. But yeah, and he has got his comeuppance. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about the Don Lemon show. I mean, you know, or, you know, the Don Lemon. I mean, I looks to me like he's out and done, because these things that he's been accused of are fairly despicable. But we'll, I imagine, speak about this all again on another occasion. As some of you know, was Earth Day. This last past weekend was Earth Day, and you know, just looking at some of the headlines out there, extraordinary. You know, like here's one from, I think it's from CNN maybe. How to allay your eco-anxiety. You know, and here's the story. If you've spent sleepless nights worrying about our planet's future, join the club. One of the ways to address that stress is to make real changes, even small ones in your everyday life. That can mean committing to composting, being more thoughtful about where you buy your clothes, or installing solar panels. Yeah, good luck with the solar panels, by the way, at the moment in California. It is grey again today. Look what I'm wearing. It's unbelievable. I'm basically dressed like I'm going to the ski slopes. Yeah, but you could install the solar panels, whatever's practical and within your means. And you know, anyway, they go on with then all kinds of tips about how to allay your anxiety. This is something that comes up later with in my interview with Stella Advice. This thing with young people being terrorised and frightened and alienated and autonomized by being constantly told horror stories about, you know, we're all going to die, you know, imminently. You know, it's, you know, 50 days to save the world, 60 days to save the world, you know, and they keep just changing the number. We always make that joke, Phelim and I, you know, that thing of, you know, environmentalism means never having to say you're sorry. You know, they're wrong about everything. It doesn't matter. Move on. Just let's scare people about something else. I saw another headline in Time magazine, the case for making Earth Day a religious holiday. And I don't think that needs me to say anything else other than just leave that headline right there. And the New York Times, of course, you know, they had this opinion an opinion essay over the weekend. Our way of life is poisoning us. And I thought this was extraordinary, from a guy called Mark O'Connell, who's the author of Notes from an Apocalypse, a personal journey to the end of the world and back. And he's basically, his thesis is, there is plastic in our bodies. It's in our lungs, it's in our bowels, it's in our blood that pulses through us. We can't see it and we can't feel it, but it's there. It is there in the water we drink and the food we eat, even in the air that we breathe. We don't know yet what it's doing to us because we've only quite recently become aware of its presence. But since we've learned of it, it's become a source of profound and multifarious cultural anxiety. And all I would say to that, and he goes on and on and on about it and about how awful it is, even though they can't work out how it's hurting us, is we seem to be doing pretty well for all the plastic that's in us. And if that's what you're really, really worried about, I thought it was very clever this weekend. Kristen Hawkins from Students for Life made a really good point, because in the arguments over abortion that are happening in America right now, and there's a lot of chat about that these chemical abortions, you know, that they're huge. Most abortions are chemical abortions. She was making the point, you know, it's an environmental disaster. If you're having all these chemical abortions, millions of them, apparently, according to the people who are pro-abortion, and these, you know, babies are being killed in that way and being flushed down the toilet, that certainly sounds like an enormous amount of chemicals being added into the system that might have a bit of an effect on us. So before they get too worried about all this plastic that this guy is talking about, I just thought she made a great point. I think she makes a great point. And why is it that the environmentalists are so quiet about that particular poisoning of the ecosystem? So we got a very nice comment from one of our listeners, viewers on YouTube, with the name, I won't actually say the name that they give themselves. It's not a proper name. But they make a really good point about the trans issue. And they said, it's funny and in a sad way. We're discouraging children from ever starting tobacco because it can cause problems like high blood pressure and strokes, ruin or rob people of their voices, and even sometimes lead to an operation on the larynx. Sometimes an operation that creates what is essentially an open wound that keeps trying to close and will disfigure the person for life. And nicotine is addictive. But we're encouraging children to go down the road where they take substances that can cause high blood pressure and strokes and will almost always ruin their voices, often necessitating operations on their larynx, etc., 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 etc. And I think that he or she, whoever it is that's writing that piece, made a very good point. You know, we make a big thing about discouraging children from smoking, and we should, by the way. And yet, at the same time, we're encouraging children to do these interventions, these, awful interventions. So we're going to go over right now to an interview I did earlier with Stella 𝙤𝙤𝙤 about her book, The Weaponization of Loneliness, which I think the title just grabbed me when I saw it on Friday. And I just think, what an interesting topic. Let's go over to that interview right now. We're now joined by my friend, Stella 𝙤𝙤𝙤𝙤, who has written a wonderful book with the most extraordinarily interesting title that I just only found out about this weekend. Stella is a senior contributor at The Federalist, where she writes about the mob mindset, cults and propaganda. Her articles have appeared in publications everywhere, and she has just written her first book, as I said, with this intriguing title, which is called The Weaponization of Loneliness. Welcome to the Anne and Phelim Scoop, Stella.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Anne. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much. And I know just before we came on, we were recording this, I know we all got the news about Tucker Carlson. I know that's really fairly much thrown you. So do you want to say anything about that before we start?
Well, it's devastating because, Fox, Tucker Carlson's show on Fox was really one of the very, very few, if not the only big major platform where people could go to get some truth. And it's devastating to know that has been, for whatever reasons, torn away. And I also have a personal reason, which is that I did an interview with Tucker Carlson 2 weeks ago that I believe was supposed to air this week on Tucker Carlson Today. And it was all about this book. And so, there's that personal level, but it's mostly on the national level that I think we're all just absolutely
in shock,
disgusted as well.
Yeah. I suppose we really don't know at this point. So this is Monday. I mean, we're, and this show comes out on Wednesday. I mean, at this point, we kind of don't know what's happened. And it really is very odd. And it's certainly odd to see that Fox News, the statement that they've put out is so succinct, so sharp, and nothing kind or nice being said about him. So who knows? I imagine by the time this show comes out, people are going to know an awful lot more. But let's talk about your book. So again, the title of the book, it really... I was really stopped in my tracks when I saw the name of the book. So it's called The Weaponization of Loneliness: How Tyrants Stoke Our Fear of Isolation to Silence, Divide and Conquer. What inspired you to write this book, Stella?
Well, Anne, my whole life, I have kind of observed these sort of interpersonal dynamics on so many different levels, all the way up to the dictatorial level in, totalitarian systems. But, we can see it on the personal level as well, whether it's a gaslighting partner or a diva who, wants to rule over everyone, or a cult leader like Jim Jones, or a toxic boss. The levels, there are so many different levels, but the dynamic, the underlying dynamic that allows these tyrants to hold on to power is their exploitation of a very natural human vulnerability, but a very natural human fear of being cast out, being socially rejected and ostracized. And the flip side of that fear is that human beings, we have a very natural need to be accepted, to be connected with our fellow man in so many different ways. And so this is a dynamic that I think we all understand instinctively. Maybe we don't want to say something politically incorrect because we don't want to offend or whatever, but we do not, I don't believe there's ever been a deep dive. I mean, believe me, I looked and looked and looked, a deep dive into these dynamics. So that's why I wrote the book,
It's interesting. I mean, loneliness is being spoken about a lot more, I think, now than any time I've remembered in the past. And I know, more people are living alone than have ever lived alone, I think, in ever in history, which brings its own, challenges, I suppose. I mean, is loneliness not part of the human condition? Is this not something that we all experience anyway?
Oh, well, sure. I mean, the epigraph for my entire book is from the book of Genesis. Um, it is not good for man to be alone. We are created for relationship with God and with one another. And that is just in our DNA, whether you want to call it our spiritual DNA or emotional or mental, it's just what makes us human. And we need that connection with others. And so, um, the loneliness epidemic that we are experiencing today is off the charts, in part because of the technological revolution that has everybody living kind of virtual lives, through screens or, social media or what have you, and less face to face encounters, which is so important for a healthy society. And, and this goes all the way back to the Industrial Revolution as well. When Emile Durkheim, the a sociologist, talked about anomie. This was 19th century. And which is that sense of feeling alone in a crowd. And so anyway, uh, the technological revolution has a huge amount to do with it, but it's also just part and parcel of these various impulses that human beings have. I call it the conformity impulse. I have a whole chapter on that. The totalitarian impulse that plays on that conformity impulse, and so on. But loneliness, one of the reasons we are fearful of loneliness is not just because it has this enormous effect on our mental well-being. I mean, the psychiatrist I mentioned, Frieda von Reichmann, theorized that loneliness was the root cause of just about all mental illness and psychosis. But also, as we know, it's well documented that social isolation can cause all kinds of physical ailments as well. I mean, and it exacerbates dementia and heart disease and all kinds of stressors caused by um, loneliness. So
Yeah, no, I
anyway,
noticed
that's
that.
just a part of the
I
picture.
unfortunately haven't had a chance to read all of the book, but that was something that definitely struck me was this, this part where you mentioned that, where it has that actually, chronic loneliness actually, makes people sick and exacerbates maybe underlying conditions that people have. Talking of illness, I mean, we've had this recent, moment in history, very, very extraordinary global moment in history with COVID, where the state pretty much in almost everywhere decided to do this thing where they isolated people. And I suppose, given the fact that more people live alone now than have ever lived alone in the past, this created an enormous amount of isolation that has never been experienced before. And we're beginning, I imagine, you're looking at that in the book, to see the results of what happened there. And the crazy things we were asked to do, the crazy stuff that people were asked to do, not leave their homes for months on end. What do you think COVID has taught us in terms of this loneliness epidemic?
Yes, well, I think it should teach us that, whatever comes next, we need to reject it. As I mentioned, the loneliness epidemic was off the charts before COVID. How there are all kinds of headlines about a loneliness epidemic, but COVID really fast tracked so much of that. And it was the first time in the history of this country, in America, that we were forced to isolate ourselves from one another, even right down to the family unit. I mean, you could see Fauci was encouraging people to reject Thanksgiving dinner together. And it also created and cultivated hostilities like we've never seen before. And that is another hallmark of totalitarian mindset, is to cultivate hostilities between people, so that, it's a divide and conquer thing. And that's exactly what was going on there. And, when family members reject one another and say, oh, you can't come over if you're not, you don't take this injection, or you don't, wear your mask, or, all of that stuff. When we knew that this, it didn't take long for us to understand that this virus was, if you didn't already have underlying serious health problems, this virus was basically 100% recoverable. Those who had serious health problems, immune compromised and all of that, yes, just like any virus, it was going to have, more of an effect on them. But for healthy people, especially youth, no. And there was no reason to separate us other than political.
And what was interesting, I think one thing that was kind of interesting, and I wonder what your thoughts on that, and I've seen you've used that word a lot in the book, the word conformity. I mean, did it shock you, the level to which people conformed? I mean, people really conformed. There wasn't mass, protests. People said, "Fine, I'll do it." People showed their. I know in another part of the book where you kind of compare it to Nazi Germany, where people showed their papers. I know I have a friend who lives in France, and the idea of what they had there was you had to print out a piece of paper, and then you wrote on the paper and said, I'm going to the pharmacy. Then if you were stopped by the cops, you'd show that piece of paper. And of course, if you weren't near the pharmacy or you'd gone somewhere else, you were obviously in trouble. How quickly people conformed to doing that. What does that tell? I mean, I think I know that's part of your thesis, right? That the fear that conformity, we do it because we're so frightened to be alone.
That's exactly right. Conformity, if we were living in a very primitive society, it could be sort of a healthy thing. You kind of see where the herd is going, and maybe they're running from some kind of natural disaster or whatever. But in a highly technological society, you've got to be a whole lot more careful about the extent to which you conform and comply with a lot of these orders coming down from on high, top down. And that's what we saw. And you asked me, how surprised I was. It was shocking to see the level of conformity. On the other hand, I hate to say, but we've been, over the decades, several decades of political correctness really conditioned us to be more, more susceptible to that conformity impulse. Is very un-American. I mean, Americans in general, ask questions like, wait a minute, why are you asking me to do this? No, I'm not going to do that. But, the problem with what we call political correctness, starting like in the 90s, where people would just shut up about what they believed, or even lied about what they believe in order to be accepted or to avoid rejection or ostracism. We are paying a very, very heavy price for that today. And we did, especially with COVID. And I just hope enough people wake up to understand how dangerous that level of conformity is. I mean, it has led to a lot of really nasty things throughout history. I have a long chapter on utopian revolutions and how the mob is a big part of that, bringing about this conformity or scaring people into compliance. And, it's very dangerous. We've given a lot of oxygen to a lot of really bad agendas, really destructive agendas, just by shutting up about what we believe. We got to stop doing that.
So, Stella, in the 80s, you worked for the CIA and you analysed the Russian media, Russian propaganda and Russian disinformation. So did the Russians weaponize loneliness?
Absolutely. If you go back through its history with the Soviet Union and every totalitarian system does this. Every tyrant does this sort of thing, where they weaponize this sense of isolation that we all can feel naturally. And that's one reason why they've always been so invested in snitch culture. And of course, a one-party state and just one media. I mean, I did media analysis and propaganda analysis. And if you look at the media, I mean, at the time they were saying that the United States, kind of used AIDS, this is in the 80s, to, kill kill off the black population, or, things like that. And of course, nobody could question it. Nobody's allowed to question it. I mean, it's the way our media operates today. I mean, we just talked at the beginning about how, Tucker Carlson, is out at Fox. I mean, because you've got this one voice that gives an alternative viewpoint. And, when you've got a kind of primarily a propaganda media, they can't tolerate any other voices. And yes, if somebody, they want the whole population to be in on their narrative. And how do you do that? You do that by cultivating those conformity impulse and ostracizing, making sure that anybody who goes against the narrative is ostracized. And, and that plays on that natural human need for connection and that natural human fear of rejection.
What can people, I mean, I know this is one of the part of your books, and I think it's good to be hopeful. I think I want us to be have some kind of hope. I mean, it's understandable, by the way, why people conform when what they could lose is so, they can lose their livelihood. People lost their livelihoods, for example, in COVID when they spoke out. So the stakes are very, very high. What can people do to protect themselves from this weaponization of loneliness?
Yeah, it feels very, very hard and counterintuitive, but people, especially those who have the backup of strong ties in their families and friends and all of that allow them to speak the truth more easily, need to lead the way and speak up, because free speech is fundamental to human relationships. We take it for granted, but we don't realize that if we can't speak openly to people, we cannot have relationships with people. And that's, very critical for, allowing freedom to flourish. And so what can we do? There are a lot of little things we can do. I mentioned in my book, I talk about helping to develop parallel institutions to take the place of the corrupted institutions. And all of our institutions are corrupt, but you got like independent journalism now. You've got, even though these seem small compared to these massive institutions that have been corrupted and subverted, we have to remind ourselves that even one voice speaking the truth is viewed as a threat to the powers that be, which means that one voice can make a huge difference. And we have to keep reminding ourselves of that. But we have to also hold on to our relationships in the private sphere of life, because the private sphere of life is the big target of all totalitarian systems, all tyrants. They're always wanting to tear down and regulate our relationships and our private lives. They want to destroy the private sphere of life. And that's really the sphere in which freedom can grow and ripple outward from. In fact, that's what Václav Havel talks about in his amazing essay called The Power of the Powerless. It all begins in that hidden sphere of life, that private sphere. We've got to invest in that. We need to reach out to others, because there's so much brokenness right now, broken families, broken faith, broken communities, and that is what totalitarianism thrives on, is that kind of brokenness, because that makes people a whole lot more susceptible to the weaponization of loneliness. I mean, if you look at members of mobs, members of cults, members of gangs, they're generally atomized individuals who come from a sense of isolation. And so they seek this pseudo intimacy, pseudo connection in mobs and cults and gangs and so forth, because they don't have that private sphere. So the solution is really to definitely hold on to and engage in that private sphere and cultivate it and speak up, because free speech, as I've said 1,000 times, is use it or lose it.
So the next the question also is that you mention, by the way, in the book, Stella, you talk about the importance of faith as a protection from this weaponized loneliness. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, sure. Our relationship with God should be one of the strongest relationships we have. And when we have faith and we have that relationship, that gives us a lot of inner strength. And of course, our relationship with other people, healthy relationships also give us a lot of strength. And this is why totalitarians, tyrants have always attacked the private sphere of life. They declared war on the family in the Communist Manifesto in 1848. They declared war, Marx declared war on religion, the opiate of the masses and so on, to ridicule it so that people would move away from developing a strong faith. There is always an attack on what gives us strength. Inner strength especially, and that's why it's so important that we cultivate our faith, especially, well, always, but in trying times like this, it's especially important to cultivate our faith and to maintain an optimistic attitude. Pessimism can be really lethal. I mean, we talked about how loneliness can be lethal, and how it creates all kinds of sickness. It can make you sick. Well, so can pessimism. I mean, that's part of kind of anxiety, really.
Yes.
And so, if you just step back and you look at the big picture, our strength comes from these relationships, and especially relationship with God. And that's why they're always trying to ridicule it and shut us up about it and weaken us in every way. I mean, you can see a war against strength, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, in all of those spheres of our lives. We are being weakened.
It's interesting. This past weekend, obviously, we had this, Earth Day that they had, and there was, and it's interesting. A lot of these headlines talk about the despair out there and the stress and the anguish because, of course, we're all about to die, and they're sending those messages. And that was one of the questions, one of the last questions I wanted to ask you about, because I feel like there's something new has happened where this loneliness epidemic is particularly hitting young people.
Yes,
and then they're getting hit again by the fact that the school is full of people telling them that everything is just desperate and everything is about to end, and that the weather is worse than it's ever been in history, and all these things that aren't actually true. Do you want to speak to that? And what do you think is happening with young people? Is it as bad as I'm describing?
Well, Anne, it's really bad. I've always referred to that as a daily diet of despair that's being taught in so many of the public schools. I mean, I saw it when my kids were in public schools, and this was a long time ago. But it's definitely, cultivating fear of death, and of course that's why religion is so important. Is you can overcome that anxiety, and cultivating this fear that, everything's going to blow up. And it is very demoralizing. And of course, demoralization is the first phase of subversion that leads to destabilization. And, these kids are destabilized. I mean, they're even taught to question their own bodies and to hate their bodies. And, with the whole transgender or gender ideology thing, they're supposed to question they can't even develop a sense of healthy identity. And, the schools have this whole social and emotional learning curriculum, which basically takes on the functions of families by telling, kids how they're supposed to feel and relate to other people. And we've got these bureaucrats in charge of that. And that's got to be demoralizing as well to, have these, forces of authority. But I have a whole chapter in there about education. But the environmentalist thing that you're talking about, absolutely plays into that. I mean, even when my kids were young in public schools, they had the weekly reader put out by Scholastic was, doing the polar bears, don't have any more snow. And I mean, it's unbelievable how it's abusive to children.
Yes.
To keep cultivating this fear and anxiety. And now you've got children who should have been, in their 20s, less than a century ago, that would be considered adulthood, are totally dependent on the mass state. And of course, that's the whole idea, is to create this demoralization and destabilization that leads to people especially youth, deciding that their savior is the state, and nothing can be more destructive.
Oh gosh, but I think I want to add, and I think you'd like to add, that the book, you have a very hopeful, prescription for how we survive this. But I think the descriptions of what's going on are very, very timely, actually, given what's just happened. How do people find your book, Stella?
Well, it's mostly available online. You just go to Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com or Goodreads.com or anywhere pretty much where books are sold online. There is a Kindle version, or if you want a hard copy, it's in paperback. And you just, you can find it there.
Yeah, we'll put up all the links where people can find it, by the way, Stella, so people will be able to buy the book.
Thank you.
But what a great achievement. And I know it was your first book, so did you enjoy writing it?
Oh, it was a haul, it was a slog, but I got a lot of the things that have been on my mind for decades, kind of put in one place. So many of the things I've read that deal with these things, but I'm just on the periphery, and, just kind of under one roof, so to speak, in this book. And, so anyway, I'm so glad that it is out.
Yes. And I really do hope that the Tucker Carlson interview that you did eventually finds the light of day. Who knows what's going to happen there. But thank you so much for your time, Stella. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. It was great talking to you.
So that was very interesting. I think we could talk a lot to Stella. I mean, I think she was making a lot of extraordinary points there, and it's all a bit disturbing, but I think she does give us some hope in her advice that people need to not be alone. People need to find community with family, friends. People need to not be subdued with their free speech. People need to claim their free speech. People need to not allow anyone to shut them up. And of course, people need, as she says, in order to combat loneliness, people need God. People need faith. So keep the faith. As I said earlier, I went to visit a friend in Mexico at the weekend, a friend who's moved down to Cabo to a very, very beautiful home. And she used to own a restaurant here, and the guy who's bought the restaurant off her, Lula Restaurant on Main Street in Santa Monica, came down to visit her and to talk business on the weekend. And she decided to teach him how to make her classic margarita. And I thought, you know what? I've got these two guys here. Why don't I film them making the margarita, and then I could share it with all of you? And I have to say, she makes a very nice margarita. And here's her recipe. Very, very simple. So in terms of ingredients, we have 1 shot of lime juice, fresh lime juice, 2 shots of Patron, of very nice tequila, and a squeeze of agave. She also uses a little tahine, and you'll see at the beginning what happens here. You see those plates there. So they're going to put a bit of lime juice in the plate. You get your glass, you put on another plate, you put the tahine, and you're just going to dip the glass into the lime juice, then into that tahine, and that's going to be a very nice decoration for your glass. Then you're going to get your cocktail shaker, and you are going to add, as I said, 1 shot of lime juice, 2 shots of the very nice Patron tequila, and squeeze of agave, and then you shake and shake and shake. And she recommends 20 shakes, which I think is also possibly something that's, kind of calisthenics or some kind of a form of exercise. There you are, you see, look at you doing your arm exercises before you have your very nice margarita. And just pour that over rocks. And I have to say, very, very, very nice. And I think possibly the shaking actually really helps, because it did, when you read it first, that recipe, to me, it seems like it's going to be super, super strong. And it certainly doesn't drink that way. It drinks very nicely and very clean. And I'm very grateful to Geraldine for all the fun at the weekend and all of the interesting thoughts about Mexican food, of which she is an expert. Before the end of the show, complete madness that I want to bring you from Denmark. I mentioned that when we were talking at the beginning. Complete madness. So a museum in Aarhus in Denmark has been renamed from Women's Museum, so it used to be called the Women's Museum, to Gender Museum Denmark. And in the middle of this place, they have created a statue of a man breastfeeding a baby as a symbol of and here's what they say, the hybrid of the masculine and the feminine in today's modern society. And there's the picture, and I know you might want to look away right now. Really dreadful. So we've come to the end of the show. Thank you very, very much for tuning in. Sorry about the interruption with our service earlier. You know, Irish internet can't be what we can't rely on it. Phelim is off on a secret mission, and he's working on writing a script that I think you're all going to be very happy about when you get to hear it. We're keeping it all under wraps for right now, but we'll hopefully have Phelim back with us very soon. So that's it from me. Have a great week. Take care.